We'll pick back up with our next section, and that is the nature of man as body and soul. Recall that the second reason why the Catechism pointed out man was so unique in paragraph 355 was that he unites the spiritual and material worlds in his nature. And so that is, man is a composite being of body and soul. That which is material, that which is immaterial or spiritual. And so what I want to do is I want to give you a few catechetical points that the Catechism highlights about man being a composite being of body and soul, and then give you a little brief, sort of an introductory, in an introductory way, a philosophical argument for the existence of an immaterial dimension to the human being. That there is something to the human being that's not merely matter, that's not matter, that is actually immaterial. We call it a spiritual soul. So the first catechetical point is found in paragraph 362. And by the way, this section of the nature of man as body and soul runs from paragraphs 362 to 368. And the first catechetical point is that the Bible reveals this hylomorphic union of body and soul in symbolic language. Now, when I speak of hylomorphic union, that's just a fancy terminology for the understanding that the human being is a composite unity of body and soul. Okay? Hylomorphic being means that you have material and immaterial united together in the human being. That's the human nature. So the Catechism points out that the Bible in the creation story, and note, in symbolic language, actually communicates or affirms this truth about the human being, that we are not mere matter, but that we are a composite of matter and spirit. Here's what the Catechism says. The human person, created in the image of God, is a being at once corporeal and spiritual. The biblical account expresses this reality in symbolic language when it affirms that then the Lord God formed man of dust from the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living being, close quote. So notice how the Catechism is authentically interpreting that particular imagery in the creation story as referring to the fact about the human being that although we have a relation, a commonality with the material world, a connection to the material world, we also have the breath of life within us. That is, that imagery of God breathing into the nostrils of man, symbolizing God is infusing the spiritual soul within the human being. So that this being of the material world would actually, whether it's an evolutionary process, and remember Pius XII allows for Catholics to believe that, of God guiding the process of, through evolutionary process, of a material being of some sort, but not the soul, right? Because the soul can't evolve. But only in regard to the body does Pius XII allow us to believe that God could have evolved what would become man's body, right? In an evolutionary process. Or we could believe that God created man, body and soul together. You get it? So option one, possibility, God creates the body of what will one day become man through an evolutionary process, maybe perhaps a material creature with high sensorial knowledge. Would it be man? No, because it wouldn't have a soul yet. It wouldn't have, well, at least it wouldn't have the intellectual or rational soul or spiritual soul yet. And then God, in his infinite wisdom, infuses a spiritual soul, unites it to that material matter, material makeup. There you have what? Adam, first man. Or God could have created Adam, body and soul together. Boom, there it is. There's Adam. All right, so, and I'll get to your question in a minute, Larry. Let me go ahead and, I think I was quoting something here. Let me find my place. Okay, so the idea is that the Catechism is interpreting that imagery from the creation account to affirm man is body and soul. Larry, go ahead, bro.
Well, my Baptist roots are kind of having a fit with that.
Yeah.
With, the creation story, which is something that I believe.
Correct.
And the evolution thing kind of makes sense, but to me, there's a departure there at what point do would I be able to argue with somebody that, okay, well, evolution went along, and then this
Right.
Homo erectus is the one that God actually breathed.
Yeah, well, the idea is this. Pius XII, in the quote from Humani Generis that we quoted in our last lecture, states that one is permitted to believe, from a Catholic perspective, one is permitted to believe, from a Christian perspective, you might say, one is permitted to believe in evolution, not of man, but only in regard to the human body, okay? Because the soul cannot evolve. So it is possible, when, think about it, when the Bible says God formed man from the dust of the earth, referencing the fact that man comes from the material world. There is something to man that is material. So it is possible that in an intelligent, directed evolutionary process that God could have formed the human body, okay? And then at a moment of time, replace what we call in philosophy the sensorial soul, possibly, okay? But that's a whole nother lecture. But that in a time, God would infuse within this material being that he's been directing along in an evolutionary process, infuse the material being with a rational spiritual soul. And whenever you have a rational spiritual soul, intellect and will, that's what that means, right? United to that material entity, that material being. And so what do you have? A composite makeup of spirit and matter. Therefore you have the first human being, the first man. Okay? So the creation account doesn't conflict with that understanding of the evolutionary process of the human body, which could which one day would become the first man. What's that?
You got woman by it happening again.
Well, what's interesting is, according to the church definitively teaches that woman, Eve, was literally created from man. So there is no church teaching in regard to woman about evolutionary process, but the common tradition, I think, from my understanding, would be that Eve was created in an instant, right? But that not the first man was in an evolutionary process, but the idea of the human body evolving, directed by God, would not have been for Eve, right? But only before Adam, the first man. Does that answer your question? So Eve, no. Adam, yes. That's right. So, the idea here, the catechetical point, is that man is a composite being of matter and spirit, body and soul. All right. Catechetical point number 2, man is not a product of evolutionary process. So here we go, Larry. Now notice on the PowerPoint, I italicized man. Because what is man? What is human being? Composite being of body and soul together, right? That's the fundamental definition of a human being, of man. And so we say, the Catechism states, man is not the product of an evolutionary process. But as we're going to see, the church allows for the possibility of the body, right? Before it would become man, the body could be the product of a directed intelligence, of a directed evolutionary process by God. So here's what the Catechism states in paragraph 362. Just listen real quick here. Man, whole and entire, is therefore willed by God. All right? Man, whole and entire, is therefore willed by God. Now here's what Pius XII states. In that same document, Humani Generis, this is his note on evolution. For these reasons, the teaching authority of the Church does not forbid that in conformity with the present state of human sciences and sacred theology, research and discussions on the part of men experienced in both fields take place with regard to the doctrine of evolution. In as far as it inquires into the origin of the human body as coming from pre-existent and living matter. Note, living matter, sensorial being of some sort. For the Catholic faith obliges us to hold that souls are immediately created by God. So let's pause right there. What is Pius XII saying? Can we say that souls can evolve? Can the spiritual soul evolve? No. But is it possible to assert that the human body could have evolved directed by God from some sort of pre-existent living matter? Yes. But if the spiritual soul can evolve, but only the body, that evolutionary process, was that man evolving? No, that wasn't man, because what was that living creature lacking? Soul, the spiritual soul, okay, to be technically correct. A spiritual soul was lacking. And so therefore it wasn't man evolving. So Pius XII is saying we're allowed to hold to the doctrine of evolution insofar as it inquires into the origin of the human body, not man. What is man? Body-soul union. You see that? Okay? Now, he goes on in the quote, however, this must be done in such a way that the reasons for both opinions, that is, those favorable and those unfavorable to evolution, be weighed and judged with the necessary seriousness, moderation, and measure, and provided that all are prepared to submit to the judgment of the Church, to whom Christ has given the mission of interpreting authentically the sacred scriptures and of defending the dogmas of the faith. So what is he saying? Is it a settled debate yet? No. So the doctrine of evolution in regard to the origins of the human body could be true. Or the doctrine that says, no, the human body was created in an instant, united to the rational soul, and there you have the first Adam. Boom. That's possible too. The Church leaves it open for debate, you see? But notice what Pius XII said. We must be docile and ready and willing to submit to the judgment of the Church when it does come. Has the Church made that judgment yet? No, she has not. But if she does, then we submit. But right now, it's open for debate. So as a catechist, I say, and I must teach, that we have these two possible options to hold to. Can I come up and say this one is definitive and that one's not? No, because the Church doesn't even say that, right? So as a catechist, I propose to you what the position of the Catholic Church in regard to the idea of evolution. So once again, evolution only in regard to the origin of the human body, but not the evolution of man as a composite being of body and soul. Okay? So, there you have it. Okay, does that help? Seeing that quote there? Yes, Pam, question. Very good question. The question is, when did her soul come into being? Your soul, the Church teaches that God directly creates our souls at the moment of conception. Okay? From the moment of conception, you have a living, and this is scientifically verified, you have a living material being, right? Okay? And because it's vivified, because it's living, we know philosophically speaking it has a life-animating principle, i.e. a soul, right? Now, because this living being is going to eventually develop into this being that can have intellectual powers and willing powers, we know that the life-animating principle of this living being at the moment of conception within of the human species, right? This human being, we know that that soul is spiritual. And this is what we're going to get to in a few minutes. We know that when we look at our actions as fully developed human beings, we can reason to our nature and see that we have a spiritual soul. That is our life-animating principle. That which makes us a living being is not purely contingent upon the material makeup of the matter, but it's actually immaterial. It's independent. Okay, so it can do these spiritual things. So if that's the case for me, well then I can go back to the moment of my conception and know that the life-animating principle of me at the moment of conception was a spiritual soul, you see? And so at the moment of conception, God infuses the spiritual soul. So am I the product of the evolutionary process, etc.? No, God creates me instantaneously, matter and soul together. Did God do that for Adam? We could say possibly so. Did he not do that for Adam? We don't know. It's possible he didn't. You see? Does that help? Okay? So God created your soul, Pam, at the moment of your conception. There's your answer.
So where does your soul stay?
What's that?
Where can you locate your soul? Where can you find your soul?
Where can I find my soul? Where does the soul stay? Okay, well that question right there implies a sort of wrong understanding of the soul. Because in philosophy, we talk about how the soul is spiritual, right? So it's not matter, so therefore it's not made up of any parts, okay? If it's not made up of any parts, it's not confined to space. Okay, so for example, my body is made up of parts. So my arm can be here, but not over there, right? So I'm confined to space because I have parts. This is characteristics of matter, okay? Now my spirit, my soul, doesn't have any parts. So where is my soul? It's not anywhere particular because it's not made up of parts. So it's not like it's in my head but not in my feet. It's not like it's in my arm but not in my legs. The soul of man is spiritual and therefore is present to the body wherever it is acting, basically. And so it vivifies and animates the entirety of my body because it's present to the whole of my body. Because spirit and body together make up the human being. So it goes a little bit deeper than that. That's just the best I can do in sort of an introductory way. But just think of it like this. The soul, the spiritual soul, is not made up of parts. If it's not made up of parts, it's not confined to space. And if it's not confined to space, then it's not in any particular part of the body.
So when does it depart from the body?
The question is, when does the soul depart from the body? The soul departs from the body at the moment of death, okay? Now think about this. The philosophical definition of death is the reduction of a composite being into its component parts. You like that one? Let me explain that to you. Okay, if you got a composite being of many parts, it has parts. Well, whenever that thing breaks down into its parts, think of Fido. He gets hit by a car. What's going to happen to Fido on the road? He's going to break down into its component parts, right? Okay? That's the very definition of death. Now, if we look at the human being has two component parts in a sense of body and soul. And at the moment of death, the body can no longer take the vivifying power, the life-animating power of the soul. And so the two depart from one another. And so there you have a composite being reduced to its component parts, and so this you have death. So the soul departs from the body at the moment of death. But because our soul is immaterial, it doesn't go anywhere. You like that one? Because guess what? Anywhere implies matter, location, space. The soul, which is immaterial, is not within the realm of location, matter, or space. So, even to say it goes anywhere, but we use that language to say it's either going to exist in the spiritual state that it will be. It is either going to exist experiencing the beatific vision, the final purification of purgatory, or the torments of hell. So think of the soul existing after death, not in locality, not in space, but existing and experiencing within itself either heaven, purgatory, or hell. Okay, you had a question. Go.
That would be like the essence. It would be the essence, right?
Yeah, the soul is the essence of the human being. Philosophically speaking, we call it the form, right? And the form of something is basically the essence, that which makes me what I am, okay? So the rational soul, united to this particular material construct, is what makes me what I am, a human being.
So, like a miscarried baby or an aborted baby,
okay?
Their essence would immediately go to heaven.
Yes, the soul, and this is where we get back to the soul, at the moment of death, because the soul is immaterial, it doesn't have parts. If it doesn't have parts, can it break down? No, wait a minute. If matter is consistent of parts, and if you have parts, it can break down into its parts, but the soul is not made of parts because it's spiritual, well then it can't break down into its parts, right? And if the soul can't break down into its parts, can it die? No. So once the soul exists, coming directly from God, of course, God creates it. Once the soul exists, can it ever die? No. And so thus we say the soul itself, the immaterial soul, is immortal, right? The immortality of the soul. So once the soul separates from the body that's going to break down, the soul has to continue to exist because it's spiritual. Now, could God annihilate the soul and snap it out of it? Yeah, he could do that. He has the power to do that, but does he do that? No. And as St. Thomas Aquinas, and I don't know if it's in these notes or not, but St. Thomas Aquinas would actually address that question and give the answer that because when God creates something, that the very existence of that something is a good. And God is committed to the good. And so even though, like for example, myself, even if I would like disobey God and go to hell by virtue of mortal sin, right? My existence is a good in and of itself to such a degree that God keeps me in existence, even allowing me to experience hell. Why? Because my existence, my being, is a good that God is committed to. So although God has the power to annihilate a soul, he doesn't because it's contrary to his wisdom. He's committed to the good because he is goodness itself. All right? Okay, Pam, go.
I got lots of questions about this. How do you explain out-of-body experience? If you're dead, is that your soul there viewing that?
Very good question. The question is, what about outer body experiences? At the Maggia Center of Reason and Faith, we're actually doing, Father Spitzer has a ton of research and information on near-death experiences, and they've actually done scientific research to show that there's verifiable evidence that these people are actually having self-consciousness and awareness of things of the material universe and what's going on. You know, to such a degree that one guy, you know, the nurse put his dentures in this on this cabinet, you know, and they couldn't find his dentures when he comes out of the cardiac arrest, okay? And he says, oh, you place them on this cart over there, and she goes, and there's the dentures, right? Because he had an outer body experience, a near-death experience. Tons of stories like that. But the idea is this, Pam, that scientifically verifiable experience through scientific research supports the philosophical understanding that I, Karlo, because I have a spiritual soul, I, Karlo, even after death, will still have my personal qualities. What are my personal qualities? Self-awareness, right? Intellect and will. The ability to love, the ability to know, the ability to give myself. And so the idea is that these near-death experiences show forth the immateriality of the human being. That there's something immaterial to us, that self-consciousness survives after death to such a degree that we're aware of what's going on in the material universe. You know, so it's not just some sort of a, you know, black, you know, experience or a shadowy experience, but there is an awareness, even though we don't have the physical eyeballs to see it, right? Because that person was literally physically dead, you know, EEG and pupils dilated and stuff and no brain activity, scientifically dead, but yet that person can see things of what's going on. So self-consciousness remains even after death, which allows us to be aware of things within the material universe, even though we don't have the physical eyeballs to see that. Okay? How does that happen? I have no idea. There must be some sort of communication into the intellect from God. All right? So, the idea is this. The soul lives on after the death of the human being, and lives on in such a way that it retains its personal qualities of intellect, intellectual awareness, self-awareness, and even the ability to interact with the material world, you see? And so, go. Hopefully that helps. Go ahead. What you got?
I was just thinking then, did your soul go to hell?
Okay.
Is it your soul that goes
Oh, yeah. Well, I, Karlo, if I separate myself from God, I will go to hell with my soul, right? But at the end of time, I'm going to get my body back. Just like the souls in heaven, they're going to get their bodies back. Even the souls in hell will get their bodies back as well. That's the general bodily resurrection. So some will rise to life with their glorified bodies, some will rise to damnation with their incorruptible bodies, but not glorified. Does that answer your question? Okay. So right now, the souls in hell, the human persons who have gone to hell, right, and even the angels, right, they're there in hell. Well, let's just restrict ourselves to the human beings. Human beings that are in hell right now are there merely with their souls. Okay. All right. Their immaterial dimension, right? The form of the body, right? So you want me to even blow your mind some more? We even philosophically we say that even the souls in heaven and the souls in hell, without their bodies, they're not fully human. Because what is a human being? Body, soul. So there's even an element, even for the souls in heaven, there's an element of anticipation in awaiting the reunification of the body and the soul, which will constitute their perfection. So they're perfect in heaven, but only in their soul, right? But at the end of time, when they get their bodies back, there's going to be a perfection in heaven of soul and body. And that's what we're ordained to. That's what we're oriented to. Steve, you had a question? Same as hers? Okay, go ahead.
When we have this assets of ours, she died for 3 days, nothing at all, declared dead. And they were making the coffin, and she got up and said, I'm hungry.
Yeah. Well, the same way we explain the fact that Lazarus was dead for 4 days and comes out the tomb, right? The idea is that it's possible that there was a departure of soul and body, but in God's infinite wisdom, He allows the soul to be reunited to the body in order that the person can still exist and experience things in the material world and the created universe in and through the body, as opposed to just being self-aware only through the soul. Yeah.
You get the feeling, or I get the feeling, that maybe somebody, a family member, somebody is there. Could it be their soul still?
Okay.
I mean, I don't mean like ghost.
Well, no, it would be ghost. Because ghost is simply the Old English word for spirit, right? Okay, so the question is in regard to if you get a feeling that a family member is there. So here's the question. Is it possible that God could allow a particular family member, or let's say a spiritual family member like the saints, right? Is it possible that God could allow a human person who is existing only with the soul right now to manifest themselves to us in the material visible world who are experiencing things through our body? The answer? Yes. You see? So if you get a feeling that someone is there, it's possible that that's a legitimate feeling, that someone is there, right? Some people even see, okay? I mean, St. Pio talked to the souls in purgatory, right? Saw souls who had come out of purgatory going into heaven. Now, it's not that these souls have a body or have their glorified body yet, but it's the fact that God allows them to manifest themselves to our sensory apparatus in a way that we can perceive them, to know that this human being is present in my presence and communicating with me. You see, angels do this all the time, right? Angels can manifest themselves to our sensory apparatus in a way that I can perceive them in order to intellectually know they're there, communicate with them, etc. But that doesn't mean that, if an angel comes with wings or something, right? Doesn't mean they have wings, right? Or if an angel appears to me in the form of a human being with a human body, doesn't mean they're human. And so the same is true even for human beings who are just with their souls. God allows them to manifest themselves to us in the visible world and to interact with us.
When you interact, though,
Yeah.
You're only interacting through your mind, right? So,
Well, not necessarily, because if they're manifesting themselves to our sensory apparatus, well, then I'm going to interact with them through seeing them, right? I'm going to interact with them through talking to them. And they might even touch me if God gives them the ability to affect the material universe by touching me and affecting my sensory apparatus of feeling, you see, whatever that feeling may be.
but then I guess when you get that feeling, then that's when you stop and pay attention, and can you force something? I mean,
Okay? I don't know about you, but if I would experience that, it would give me reason to stop and pay attention and pray about it indeed, Now, granted, we need to always be aware and conscious of our loved ones who have deceased and praying for them. But at the same time, in saying that, we need to be careful not to always be looking, you see, under every rock for an experience of our loved ones appearing to us or an angel appearing to us, etc. But it's possible. God does allow those things to happen. I've heard of a story, and I don't know where it comes from, but I've heard the story about St. Pio, eating at the dinner table with the fellow friars, and he just gets up, goes to the door, and is talking to somebody, and then comes back, sits down, and, Father Pio, who were you talking to? Oh, it was just a soul from purgatory thanking me on his way to heaven. Things like that have happened. The saints have communicated with other saints. Jesus appears with people, to people. The saints appear to people. Angels appear to people. There is communication between the visible world and the invisible world. And that's the beauty of God's created order, you see? Okay. Any other questions? This is good. Thanks for asking the questions. Yeah.
I had an experience. It was my best friend in the service was killed in an airplane crash out in the China Sea. It was Christmas. And the night that they went in, his mother in Los Angeles, California, he was standing at the foot of her bed, and he said, "Mother, my head hurts." The next day, when they picked him up with a tin can, he had this huge lump on his head.
Wow. Yeah, and she sensed that. She saw him, she heard him, etc. Amen. And these are legitimate experiences, And so God allows those things to happen. It's the mystery of how, pure spirit, things of a spiritual nature, can interact with things of the material world. You see, that's the mystery of how that happens.
The thing about it was she didn't even know that he was killed.
Right, so it couldn't have been any form of hallucination or anything, Yeah.
So, are people, everybody can experience this, right?
Yeah, it's possible, yeah.
So, it's,
The question was, can everybody experience these things? And the answer is yes, it's possible for everybody to experience these things. Okay? Yeah.
I have a first cousin, she was very close to me, and when she died, we heard the gate open, so I look at the gate, and here she is in front of me in the white clothes, but she has no face. So is she communicating with me?
It's possible. It's possible. Yeah, it's possible that these things are real. That these are real people, souls who are communicating with us in the visible world. Now, at the same time, not to say that this is your experience, okay? So I don't want to undermine your experience of things. But at the same time, we also have to make make a little exception that it's possible that when we see things, we might be hallucinating, right? Okay? That's a possibility. Or imagination, right? Now, I'm not saying that's your experiences, okay? So please don't get me wrong. But I just want to let us know that although it's possible that these things can really happen, it's also possible that our minds can play tricks on us, we can hallucinate, etc. So we just got to keep that in mind. So just because, the point being, just because your friend comes up and says, "Oh, I saw Grandma," or "I saw Papa," or "I saw this," or "I saw that," just be aware it's possible that happened, but it's also possible that it was some form of a hallucination. Does that make sense? Okay? Okay. Now, let's move on. We were on catechetical point number 2, about the nature of man as body and soul, that is, man in and of whole and entire is not a product of the evolutionary process. Now, we come to catechetical point number 3, and that is the human body shares in the dignity of the image of God. Okay? The human body shares in the dignity of the image of God in paragraph 364. The first thing to note is the rationale behind this. Notice how we said man is a body-soul composite, right? Well, if man is in the image of God, whole and entire, well then his body also comes into play there. His body also is involved in the image of God. All right? How so? Well, Blessed Pope John Paul II had a whole many years of catechesis on that, and how the body is the visible representation of our call to what? Our call to a communion of love, which is the very essence of the Trinity, right? So we see in that way how our body can actually be involved in the image of God. The second thing to note is the significance of this truth. If the catechism, why is the catechism highlighting the bodies involved in being in the image of God? And the catechism is highlighting this because it's asserting that the body is good. It signifies the goodness of our body. You know, many times the Catholic Church is criticized for, being down on sex, and the body's bad and sex is bad, and we got, the Catholic Church is all about prohibiting us in our freedom of expression of our sexual desires and this and that. Well, nothing could be further from the truth. And very often the catechesis may have very well been that. Catechetical classes from the pulpit. In the past, there may have been a catechesis of sex is bad, the body is bad, sex is dirty, and this and that. But that's not Catholic teaching, right? But the catechism is affirming the body is good. And it's precisely because the body is so good and sacred that we say no to all of the things in modern society that violates the body and the goodness and sacredness of the body, you see? So it's because of the yes to the sacredness and goodness of the body that we say no to various sexual behaviors that violate the body. All right, here's what the Catechism says in paragraph 364. Man, though made of body and soul, is a unity. Through his very bodily condition, he sums up in himself the elements of the material world. Through him, they are thus brought to their highest perfection and can raise their voice in praise freely given to the Creator. For this reason, man does not despise his bodily life. There it is. Rather, he is obliged to regard his body as good and to hold it in honor, since God has created it and will raise it up on the last day. You see, the Christian faith is all about the body. The body is a good, sacred, holy thing, not something to be disposed of, but indeed a mystery to be reverenced, a good to be reverenced. Okay, so that's our third catechetical point. The human body shares in the dignity of the image of God. Fourth catechetical point. The soul is the life-animating principle of the body. The Catechism states in paragraph 365, the unity of soul and body is so profound that one has to consider the soul to be the form of the body. I.e., it is because of its spiritual soul that the body made of matter becomes a living human body. Spirit and matter in man are not two natures united, but rather their union forms a single nature. So the essence of human nature is body and soul united. And when the Catechism speaks of the form of the body, it's drawing off of philosophical language coming from Aristotle, perfected by St. Thomas Aquinas, in regard to form and matter. All right, so like you have matter there that you have your elbows on, right? That's matter. The table is made up of matter, right? Material stuff. But it has the form of what? Has the form of a table. So you get the idea of form and matter. Well, what you see before you is a makeup of material stuff, right? The body. But this material stuff has the form of a living being of the human species, namely a rational human being. Okay, so the form, the idea of form and matter go together, because without form, you don't have the table, you just have matter, right? Without the matter, you just have the idea of a table, you see? But you don't have the actual existence of a table until you have the matter and the form together. Simple enough? Well, you look before you right now, a human being. Without the form, the essence, and you got to that a while ago, without the essence, without the form, this material stuff will be what? It will be a corpse, right? It's called after death. That's what happens. When I'm buried 6 feet under, this material stuff that you see before you won't have the form of a human being. The soul, the living soul, the rational soul. So it's just going to decay. But what happens when you have the form without the matter? You just have an idea of a man, right? So let's think of who's a fictional character? Who? Superman. That's right. Clark Kent, right? Does Clark Kent have the form or the essence of a man? Yeah. It's an idea in the mind, right? But does Clark Kent actually exist? No, because he does. Sure he does. I burst your superhero bubble, Steve. I'm sorry. But he doesn't have an actual existence because there has never been a union of the essence of Clark Kent and matter. Does that make sense? Okay. So when the Catechism talks about the soul being the form of the body, that's what it's getting to. Our soul is that which makes this material stuff a living human being. And it is such a unity that my material makeup and things that happen to the body will affect the powers of the form, the soul. You see? Intellect and will. So if I get in a car wreck, right? I don't have good, and I damage my brain, what's going to happen to my intellectual powers? They're going to be weakened, right? Because the soul is the form of the body. And they're so intimately united that they affect one another. Okay? And so this is what the Catechism is getting at. Go ahead. That raises another good question, doesn't it?
Okay. So if I'm brain dead,
Okay.
I still have a soul.
That's right. And as long as the soul, this is what's interesting, as long as the soul, okay, philosophically, when we look at the human person, I am able to do things with certain ideas. I'm able to generate certain spiritual ideas. And my intellect can function even independently of the body. It uses the body to take in the information, right? I use my sight, I use my taste, I use my senses to take in information, but then we do something very interesting. We call this abstraction. We begin to abstract certain ideas. We begin to abstract forms. I see a table, I abstract tableness, right? But then that idea is not confined to that particular table, right? Because I can go in the back room, find another, material composite of things, right? And then see that's a table too, but it's not that particular one. So what we do is we can abstract these forms or these ideas, which are not particular, but they're universal. And if they're not particular and they're universal, they're spiritual, right? Okay, so the point is this. I can do things in my intellectual capacity, my intellectual knowledge, that's independent of my body. So I see my intellect can act independently of my body, but on the flip side of the coin is that the intellect uses the body to get the knowledge. So they're connected, right? They're not the same, they're not identical, but there's a union of the two. Consequently, when my brain is affected, my soul's ability to know, my intellect's ability to function is going to be hindered as long as it is united to the damaged brain. You're driving in a car, you get in a wreck. You're a driver, but your ability to drive is impeded because of your damaged vehicle, right? By way of analogy, the intellect united to the brain right now in my existence, and the way I'm existing right now as a composite being, and because of that unity, as long as if my brain is weakened or damaged, guess what's going to happen to my knowledge? It's going to be hindered because it's united. But the interesting thing is that once death occurs and there's a separation of the soul and the body, because the soul is immaterial and because the soul must live on and it can function independently of the body, we've already proven that, it still has knowledge. It still can attain knowledge. It's a mysterious, interesting thing. So there's a unity, but they're not identical. And so thus the soul can actually function even without the body. Although when united to it, it depends on the body. Any thoughts on that?
So when I lose my body,
Yeah.
my soul goes,
The soul continues to exist.
reunite reunited with my body,
Yes.
am I going to be martyred?
Oh, yes, you, yeah. Yeah, that's a good question. Will we be smarter when we get our glorified bodies back? And the answer will be yes. We will be smarter because even though you will continue to exist by God's grace in heaven, you will grow in your knowledge in heaven because you will grow in knowledge of God's salvific plan as it continues to play out in human history, okay?
Soul is growing in heaven.
Well, your soul is, you're growing in knowledge as you're in heaven, okay? And even with the glorified body, you're going to be smarter. You're going to have a sharper intellect, right? Okay? You're going to have a sharper intellect. You're going to have a sharper will. You're going to be a lot more perfected as a human being than what you are now. So will we know more in heaven and with our glorified bodies? The answer is yes.
So when you're talking about I will be in heaven, you're talking about my soul.
Right now, correct. Now, when we're talking about the end of time and the new heaven and new earth, when I speak of heaven, and even right now, when I speak of heaven, I don't speak of heaven as a locality that's over there and not here. I speak of heaven as the experience of the beatific vision that generates a happiness within the soul. Because Jesus, you want me to blow your mind on this one, Jesus, while he walked on this earth, he was, quote unquote, in heaven. What does that mean? While he was locally on this earth in time and space, his rational soul, his human soul, was experiencing the beatific vision of the divine nature. You see? So
We can't be in
heaven on earth?
We can't experience it.
At the end of time, we will. Yes. Yeah, but right now, for us, like Karlo, Broussard, no. Okay? I will not experience the beatific vision until after death. Okay? That's the way things are going to go. Now, if Adam and Eve didn't sin, guess what? That would have been a possibility. You see? But since the sin of Adam and Eve, that's not a possibility in this time of human history, because there's going to be a definitive reign of Christ when he comes and wipes away all sin, and we will exist on the new earth and the new creation, existing in a locality with material bodies and material space. However, it's going to take on new characteristics, right? But what are we going to have? The beatific vision. You see? So, will heaven and earth be one? Yes, heaven and earth will be one. Will we see the angels? I don't know. Will they manifest themselves to our new physical glorified eyeballs? I don't know. But will I see you, Pam? Indeed I will, because you're going to have a glorified body. I'm going to have a glorified body. I'm going to say, hey, Pam, boy, you got some bright light shining off of you, girl. Look at you with all that glorified pretty body. You see? And so, by the way, we're going to get better bodies in the glorified bodies too, right? All the aches and the pains that you wake up with are going to be gone. Say, tout fini, as we say in Louisiana. Okay. All right. So, the last catechetical point, talking about the nature of man as body and soul, is the soul is directly created by God and is immortal. This is in paragraph 366. I'm going to go ahead and ditch the PowerPoint here because we're running out of time. So we're just going to kind of go through the handout with you. You can read paragraph 366. And what it says. Remember, Pius XII noted this, that the soul is immediately and directly created by God, right? This is why we can't say that man, whole and entire, is the product of an evolutionary process. Only in regard to the origins of the human body. Why? Because the human body can develop and evolve and change because it's matter, right? It's of the material world. But because the soul of a human being is a rational spiritual soul, it cannot change. It cannot evolve in the sense that matter can. So it can only be created directly and immediately by God. And this is what the Catechism is affirming in paragraph 366. Now, as you see there on your handout, I have talking about philosophical arguments for the existence of the immaterial soul. I basically kind of already did that in an introductory fashion as I was trying to answer your questions. And the idea is this. The fact that I can generate an idea, right? Think about it. There's a philosophical principle that states action follows being. In other words, action follows nature. Remember we talked about this, how nature determines what you can and can't do? You remember when we spoke about that, understanding nature and person? Nature is the source of action, person is the doer of action. Nature determines what you can and cannot do, right? Okay, so if we look at the action, if we observe the actions of a human being, we can reason to what sort of nature the human being has, what sort of nature I have. And so when we observe the human being, we discover something unique about the human being that differentiates the human being from the animal world. And that is the ability to have spiritual knowledge, immaterial knowledge, intellectual knowledge. Case in point, I can generate the idea of courage. I can generate the idea of cowardice, right? And I can generate the idea of loyalty and disloyalty. Now, and I can even desire one over the other and say, I don't want to be a coward. I want to be a courageous, brave man, right? Now, think about this. All of these ideas that I've just generated, they have no likeness to the material world whatsoever. How much does courage weigh? What color is courage? What does cowardice smell like, right? Can I measure the depth or the height or the width of courage and cowardice? Now, these questions sound absurd, right? Because they are. Because the ideas of courage and cowardice have no likeness to the material world whatsoever. And all of those questions I just asked pertain to what? Matter. The material world. The observable world. But the ideas of courage and cowardice and whatever idea I generate are not of the material world. And so what are they? They're immaterial. They're non-matter. Remember the table, right? I see this thing. I see this material construct there. And I, as a human being, I'm able to extract the idea of table, independent of that particular table, and apply the idea of table to some other material construct that takes the form or the essence of what? A table. So notice how the ideas that I can extract from the material world, these are universals. They're not confined to particular things of matter. So guess what? They're not dependent on matter. They're not material. They're immaterial. Now watch this. If this is true, and we can prove that these ideas that I generate, these forms that I know, these universals that I know, if they're not material and they're immaterial, well then what's producing them? Is it the brain? How can matter produce something that's not matter? It's impossible. So if I can produce something immaterial, and matter cannot produce something immaterial, well then guess what? The only other explanation is that there must be something immaterial to me that allows me to generate immaterial ideas. And another word for immaterial is spirit, spiritual. So what we say in philosophy is this: the life animating principle of my material construct, that which makes me a living being, the soul, my soul is immaterial. It's spiritual. Why? Because I can produce spiritual or immaterial ideas. And so this is the argument by way of human knowledge. There's tons of more arguments in philosophy that we could use to show that there exists within us an immaterial dimension to the human being. And so what's the point? We're not just matter, folks. We're not just merely matter, just a composite summary of material constituents, but there's actually an immaterial dimension. And if it's immaterial, can it die? Nope. It can't, because it doesn't have parts, and if it doesn't have parts, it can't break down. So although the body decays, what happens to the spiritual soul continues to exist. Okay? All right, so let's see here. I got 3 more pages here. 2.5 more pages, and I know Lee back there might be saying a few more words, so I'm going to respect his time. I'm picking on you, Lee. All right, so you have 2 more sections there. Man as male and female in paragraphs 369 to 373. You can check that out. I'll just run through the handout with you real quick. First catechetical point, man and woman are both equal and different. The equality comes by virtue of we're human persons made in the image of God. Amen? And so therefore we have equality in that aspect. But there is a difference. There is a difference in being man. There's a difference in being woman. And the Catechism in paragraph 369 emphasizes the goodness of that difference, which which is what is being attacked in modern society with gender identity, homosexual activity, okay? The goodness of gender difference is what is being attacked in modernity right now. And so it's absolutely important that we as Catholics know the teaching of the church and even God's revelation, right? About the goodness of the distinction between masculinity and femininity. God made male and female. So there's a goodness in that distinction. Catechetical point number 2, man and woman are made by God, each for the other. Okay? So there's a complementarity there, where man and woman are made for each other, for communion. You see? And there are 2 ways that the Catechism highlights that male and female are made for each other. Number 1, they're made to be a helpmate for each other. Catechism points this out in paragraph 372, referencing Genesis 2:18, when God specifically creates Eve to be the helpmate for Adam. So it's the idea of service. God creates man and woman to serve one another. And through the gift of self in service, they can enter into communion with one another, right? So it's for the sake of love that man creates man and woman. Think about the Genesis creation account. You know, God creates the animals. God creates Adam. What does he find? He finds nothing to complement him as a human being, right? He cannot find that being that is similar to him to enter into communion with as a human being. So God creates Eve. And with the creation of Eve, they can enter into communion with one another, a communion of knowledge and a communion of love, which are the 2 essential characteristics of persons. A personal relationship. You see that? Now, the second way in which they're made for each other, obviously, is for the sexual union and the propagation of the human species. This is the point of the sexual complementarity of male and female. To enter into a union with one another to propagate the human species. We spoke about this in the past, by virtue of our nature, this is one of the dimensions that our Creator has ordered, nature has ordered, our sexual powers to. And that is the propagation of the human species. But that sexuality also has the dimension of communion and love. And the only communion of love and knowledge that can embrace both the unity of love and the procreation dimension is a heterosexual union. That a male and female with sexual complementarity. And thus we say heterosexual union is the only natural end of our sexuality. Thus saying that anything that would contradict that or violate that would be a violation of human nature. And so this is all based upon the idea of the goodness of the distinction of male and female. God created man, God created woman. That's the foundation for everything else we believe about man and woman, and in particular about human sexuality. And then finally, as you see there on your handout, we have man in paradise, and this is found in paragraphs 374 to 384. And this is absolutely essential for our next lesson. Because when we talk about the fall of man, we'll be coming back to what we learn about man in paradise, about how God created man. Catechetical point number 1, as you see on your handout, man was created in a state of original holiness in paragraphs 374 to 375, and this is also explained in 1997, as you see there on your handout. What is original holiness? Very simply, Adam was created in friendship with God. What does that mean? Adam was created with sanctifying grace in his soul. What does that mean? Adam was created as an adopted son of God. Adam was created in familial relationship with God, and he was partaking of the divine nature through sanctifying grace. What you and I receive at the moment of baptism, right? Adam had at the moment of his creation. Adam had at the moment of his creation what we don't have at the moment of our creation. And that's the state of original sin. We'll get to that next week. And so you see on your handout there the biblical clues for this original holiness. The Garden of Paradise, the phrase of being created in the image and likeness of God in the Hebraic tradition suggests familial relationship. St. Luke actually tells us in Luke 3:38, Adam was a son of God, implying that he was created in familial relationship with God. That's the state of original holiness. But the Catechism also teaches us, in paragraph 376, that Adam and Eve, before the fall, when they were created in a state of original justice. And there are 4 elements to the state of original justice. Number 1, preservation from suffering and death. You can check that out in paragraph 376 as well as paragraph 1008. And as the church teaches us, had Adam and Eve not sinned, there would have been no suffering and there would have been no death. That was a part of the original justice, preservation of freedom from suffering and death. Secondly, inner harmony of the human person, right? You ever experience the fact that you do what you know is you ought not to do? You do what you know you ought not to do, and you can't do what you know you ought to do, right? You ever experience that? I don't know about you, but I experience that every day. Okay? Well, that inner conflict between intellect and will, and even the conflict between, like, you have this desire for like the 5th piece of cake, but you intellectually know that might be gluttony, but you go for it anyway, right? That tension, instead of perfectly saying, well, I've had my quota and my fill, and I'm perfectly filled, and I've achieved the satisfaction from that cake. Well, that inner conflict, Adam and Eve didn't have that before the fall. That was a state of the original justice. Inner harmony of the human person between intellect and will, the soul, and even between the soul and the body. That is, between the soul and the bodily appetites, desires, etc., and even emotions. And you can check out paragraph 377 where the Catechism explains that. Thirdly, harmony between man and woman. And that's one we all know, right? Especially those of us who are married. Have you ever experienced conflict in marriage between man and woman, male and female? A little tension there. Before the fall? Not so. Man and woman, Adam and Eve, were created with harmony with each other. That's a part of original justice. And the biblical clue for that is that they were naked without shame. The Catechism actually points that out. They were naked without shame. That's a hint to that harmony between male and female. And then finally, the last element of the state of original justice was harmony between the first couple and all of creation. You remember how we said last week in our last lesson that God in his infinite wisdom created a world in a state of journeying to perfection, which implied some things to come into existence, some things to go out of existence, and even implies destructive forces of nature, right? But before the fall, even though that stuff existed, there would have been perfect harmony between man and creation. Those destructive forces of nature, that's the result of a world in journey. The destructive forces of nature of the animal world feeding upon each other and death existing of the animal within the animal world. There would have been perfect harmony between man and all of the created world. Nothing of the material universe, nothing of the created world would have harmed man. That's a part of original justice. This is man in paradise. Original holiness and original justice. Think of perfect harmony. But guess what? As we're going to see next week in our lesson, all of that gets messed up. Okay? And there is a loss of original holiness and original justice. And so next week we shall talk about that.